Let's work on renaming and reorienting our hair joints. Just to give you an idea of the naming structure I'll use for the hair, for instance at the very side, what we can do with these joints is name them something along the lines of BN L hair FT for front A01. So this is the first joint of this section of the hair. I'll go ahead and copy that name, go to the next joint, paste, and that will be hair B. The one at the very end will be BE hair C. So going to the next section, we can go ahead and use a similar naming structure, only instead of hair FT, we'll label this hair BK for back. And that's A01. We'll copy the name, go to the next, paste. That's going to be B. And then you get the idea. The last one is going to be BE, hair BK, C. Now when we get to the very back, since it's at the center, feel free to use mid. I might use something along the lines of that same naming structure, but get rid of the underscore L. So just leave this BN, hair BK, A, and B. And then this last one, BE, hair C. Now for the bangs, this one on the very right side, we can label BN underscore R underscore bang or bangs A01. All right, so we can go ahead and rename the next one to B and so on and so forth. For the one in the center, again, you could always use mid or simply get rid of the part of the name that identifies this object as the right or left side. So this will just be left as BN bangs 01. Can copy the name and rename the end joint to BE bangs if you like. Or you can use A and B. Really doesn't matter, just as long as it's clear. So this one, of course, will be renamed left instead of right. All right, so that's the naming structure we could use. What we'll now want to do from here is head over to our outliner. Let's go ahead and grab all of these joints and show their local rotation axes. That way we can always keep track of their orientation. So how are we going to fix this? What we've created with that script was world joints. So this is going to be actually quite simple. Being that they are world joints, that means that their orientation is 0 in the rotate channels and also in their joint orient attributes. So what we could do then is use an aim constraint to point to the following joint, and then we can clean up things by removing the values of our rotate channels and replacing those values in our joint orient attributes with the values from our rotate channels. So once we've managed to do that, again, once we transfer the values from our rotate channels to our joint orient channels, we would then zero out our rotate channels. What we're left with is a joint that has been reoriented while still keeping its rotation set to 0. Now, this can be very time consuming, so of course we can use a script to have this done at a faster pace. So let me go ahead and show you that script. Heading back over to our script editor, we could always go ahead and clear everything out. I'll choose File, Load Script, choose our script folder, and what we want to do is choose the Zero Joint Rotation tool. Let's go ahead and grab that Mel tool and choose Open. All right, so what I'll now do is highlight everything, Control A, middle click and drag to the shelf to add it. And let's go ahead and explain this process. All right, so the first thing we do is we find our selection. The next thing we do is we find any aim constraint tied to our selection. So for instance, our joint that gets aim constrained, we're going to want to remove that aim constraint. So that's what we're doing in the first part of this code. We find the aim constraint, again with the list relatives command, type aim. And then from there, we select the aim constraint and delete it. Next, what we do is we find all of our rotate channels with the getAttr command, and we store that in a float variable since we're grabbing values. So we store that in these float variables. Next, what we do is we set the joint orient channels to the values of our rotation channels. So here's the setAttr command. Again, we set our joint orient x in this case to the value of our rotate x. Once all of those have been mapped, we then zero out our rotate channels, and we're left with an oriented joint. So let's go ahead and put this to use. Let's go ahead and head over to our shelf editor and just rename the tool. So we'll rename this to our zero joint rotation tool. You can always copy that, use that as the tooltip, and label this ZJR for zero joint rotation and save our shelf. All right, so here's how we're going to take care of this. What we want to do is grab not the root joint, but the joint following it, because we want to parent or point the root down the hierarchy so that X is pointed down this chain. So we grab the mid joint, we shift select our joint that will be aimed, and then at that point, we apply an aim constraint. We'll want to use the default settings. Let's go and reset the settings and choose Add. You can see now X is pointed down. So at this point, we can use our zero joint tool to clean this up. So watch this. When we apply that, notice the joint no longer has rotate values. Those rotate values have been transferred to our joint orient channels. Now with that said, there is just a little bit of cleanup work to do afterwards. So for instance, see how the joint is still angled in a weird way? Well, we want the orientation to kind of flow with the hair mesh. So in our case, we can go ahead and take the x-axis and start to modify that so that the joint's orientation rests along the hair a little bit nicer. So that's much better. We'll want to bring this value over to about a value of 15 in this case, but that seems to work. So now we can go ahead and take care of the next one. Feel free to add the aim constraint tool to your shelf. So I'll hold down Control Shift, constrain, aim. All right, so we know the process now. So for the next one, we grab our end joint, we shift select the joint above it, add an aim constraint. All right, taking a look at our values, let's go ahead and zero out this joint's rotation. You can see how X is pointed in the direction it needs to, but notice the Y-axis, it is not pointed away from the hair like the first joint. So this first joint is ideal. So let's go ahead and tweak that. What we want to do is have the joints on our left side match closer to a value of 0. So with that being said, we could always zero out the X-axis, and notice now it's a lot easier to have the Y-axis face the way we want it to. So we could start to edit the joint and get it to the point where the Y-axis is pointed out. Okay, so it looks like about a value of maybe 14, or from 12 to 14 would work just fine. Okay, so at this point, it's just a matter of grabbing our end joint, parenting it to the joint before it, taking that joint, parenting it to our root joint of the hair. We can now clean up the orientation of our end joint by zeroing out our joint orient channels. Feel free to also use the code, but in the code, remember we look for an aim constraint, so you may get a warning saying that there's no aim constraint applied. No problem, the code will still work. So that's the process for the rest of these. When you get to the right side, let me go ahead and show you this. Instead of using a value of 0, we'd want to have a value that is closer to 180, simply because we'd want these joints to be mirrored from the left side. All right, so for instance, in this case, we can take our root joint. Let's go ahead and apply our aim constraint. And we'll go ahead and remove the aim constraint with our tool. And now, taking a look at things, let's go ahead and set the joint orient axis here to 180. And notice the Y is pointed away from the hair. So again, that's ideal. Now we can make some minor tweaks to finish up. All right, so again, we grab our two joints, we apply our aim constraint, we clean up the joint. Let's grab the joint, set the X value to 180 to start, and then we can start to tweak that a little bit further. Okay, how about the back of the hair? Let's go ahead and get these aim constraint, and again, we'll just want the Y-axis pointed out. So let's go ahead and see what the aim constraint does. We'll go ahead and zero out our joint. And then looking at things, let's go ahead and zero out our joint orient axis in the X. That'll get us a closer way to the joints at the back pointed in the orientation that would be ideal. So look at this. Look at the value here. It looks like a value of -90 would work well as a start. So with that in mind, we can go ahead and take care of the other joint. Again, we apply our aim constraint, use our joint meld tool to remove the aim constraint. I'll set the joint orient to -90, and that actually looks like it'll work just fine. Okay, great. So that's the process for the rest of these. So what I'll do in the next lesson is have the orientation for the rest of these taken care of. Just take your time and make sure Y is pointed correctly away from the hair as the others, and it'll be just fine. So in the next lesson, again, I'll have the orientation taken care of. I'll also have the rest of these renamed. If you need to, feel free to use that file as reference so you know exactly how to orient your joints, but we should have a good idea of how to do that now. And what we'll start doing also in the next lesson is just setting up hair controls.